Every now and then on the Mindful podcast, I like to introduce our listeners to people I think you should meet, either because that person's really interesting or their area of study is of particular fascination to me. In the case of today's guest, both of those things are the case. My name is Eric Bowman. I'm the communications specialist at the Canadian Psychological Association, and this is Mindful. I spend a lot of time thinking about my dogs. Dogs that have passed, like Rocky and Apollo and Odie and Muffin. Odie, by the way, was named OD, the initials, by our kids, and it stands for other dog. I thought it was very clever. And our current dog, Steve. Now, each of them has such a distinct personality, which is usually really interesting, but also sometimes baffling. Rocky and Apollo would sit right at my feet in the kitchen the whole time I was preparing dinner, and no matter what fell, they were on it. Like, I was really used to not cleaning the kitchen floor because I had two Roombas constantly doing it for me. But Steve is way more discerning. Carrots fall, he's a missile scooping them up. Cheese falls? Meh, not interesting. Now, animal behavior and the way we perceive it is something I find really interesting, and it's what we're going to talk about with today's guest.
So my name's Hannah Burrows. I am a second-year master's student in cognitive neuroscience at Queen's University. I study the dog-human interaction, specifically looking at impulsivity and undesirable dog behavior. So those applications can be for rehoming or training practices, things like that.
All right, and when you say impulsivity in human-dog interactions, is that impulsivity from a dog's perspective or impulsivity from the person's perspective?
We're starting with the person because it's really hard to tease those two things apart. So actually, we just did a survey of over 500 dogs or owners and their perception of their dog's impulsivity. So we just created a survey, which is called PUPS. So it's Perception of Undesirable Pet Behaviors survey. And the survey encompassed, nobody had really looked at this, people having problems with their animals, specifically their dogs. And we got over 500 respondents from different countries, which was really cool. But predominantly people tended to fall in different areas where they had undesirable behavior around the home, undesirable behavior in social interactions, and then fear and anxiety sort of encompassed one entire factor of our entire survey, which is pretty interesting because people that are in the dog literature really tease those two apart. And there's different ways that you can sort of see this dog's actually more anxious than being aggressive. But our pet owners, and this is just people that own dogs in different places, all of them sort of saw those as the same thing, which is pretty interesting. They don't really see anxiety as a fear thing. They just see it as this is just an undesirable behavior, which is pretty interesting too.
So is the idea there my dog gets aggressive and barks at anybody who comes to our door for any reason, and I can't really tell whether he's being aggressive and wants to fight the person at the door or whether he's just anxious that someone new's coming into the house and he's afraid about it and he's going to be loud about it in that way? I can't really distinguish those two things. Is that what we're talking about, where pet owners can't figure out the difference there?
Exactly. Yeah. And when we found our survey, we had undesirable behaviors in public. So it's you don't want to take your dog to the pet store. You're worried about a busy environment. And then there was fear and aggression, which is the one we're talking about, where it's maybe barking at people. That was correlating with shadowing behind a person or fear at separation or fear related body language. So all those questions hung together, which is pretty interesting. And then we had difficulties with training and obedience. So your dog really doesn't learn commands quickly, doesn't come when they're called. And then we had undesirable behavior on the home. And all those things encompass how people view undesirable behaviors or impulsivity with dogs, which is pretty cool.
And is there a way to tell those things apart? If my dog is being aggressive, how do I know that versus being apprehensive and frightened?
That's a great thing. It's tricky because it depends on the history of the dog as well. Certain rescues, I think people have a very difficult time following basic operant sort of why isn't my dog learning these things without knowing like the training history of the dog and the breed. The breed also depends on a lot of things, right? Like if you have a retriever, like they're going to retrieve.
Right.
It's like the common joke. But I think especially with like fear and anxiety, usually like when the dog has their tail between their legs, that's like a very telling factor of like anxiousness or like cautiousness or fear of somebody. Especially like, again, it depends on the breed and the size of the dog too, but people tend to sort of equate fear with like aggression, but they also like don't necessarily always, it can be like just misattributed in different contexts, I guess.
Yeah, I presume 90% of the time that my dog is being apprehensive and fearful because he's so tiny that for him to be aggressive would be ill-advised on his part.
Yeah.
He's a Chihuahua mix and he's very small, right?
Oh, that's so cute. Yes.
I'd show him to you, but he's outside right now, so he doesn't bark through this entire thing. He would hear your voice and I feel get apprehensive about it and bark the whole time.
Yeah, I think like another one is like it depends on like the trigger. So like fear could be like where there's a really loud noise versus like anxiety is sort of like that building up like lack of separation, lack of routine, like a change in the environment over a certain amount of time. Like I find that they can kind of be teased apart with different contextual factors of the dog as well. And like different there's like tucked tail, flattened ears, lip licking's another one that's related to both. So it's sort of hard to like tease them apart without the context in different contexts, but yeah.
And with this research, are you hoping to put it all into a larger context? I mean, are you hoping to have a guide for dog owners, cat owners, ferret owners to let them know, what behaviors mean what in a more comprehensive way than we understand it now?
Exactly. Yeah, I think so. When I started looking into what I wanted to look, I knew I wanted to work with dogs, but when we were looking at the literature around like impulsivity and undesirable behaviors, the like stats behind how many dogs are rehomed just because like the people can't handle the dog, for example. That's a very common thing. There's a lot of dogs that end up being like given away to shelters or like families can't handle them. And most of it's attributed to like these sort of self-control, like the animal doesn't have a ton of self-control. But the more we looked into the literature, like there's no way to really measure that in terms of like what the person's perception of the dog's behavior is. So that's why we came up with the survey was to see like is this like a first stab at seeing like how people are perceiving their animals' behavior. And now we're going to correlate that with in-lab actual impulsivity tests because that's really important. Like if somebody's saying that they do all these things with their dog and then they come into the lab and it's a very different thing, like that's also very interesting. There's research that was just done, I think it was published like last year, and they based it on human developmental parenting styles. So they used three of them. So there's like permissive, authoritative, and authoritarian. And they mapped this onto pets. So they were looking at like, are you a permissive parent with your dog? Are you authoritative with your dog, for example? So we're going to be using that as well because we want to see if, for example, say the permissive parents are the ones that are saying like, oh, I have a lot of problems with my dog, for example. And then they come into the lab and maybe that like group tends to really have different perceptions of their dog's behavior and then that implicates why the dog is experiencing like higher impulsivity or higher perceived undesirable behaviors, for example. And that could help tease apart a lot of like the problems that hopefully we can sort of like mitigate with training and things like that.
Yeah, we did a podcast episode within the last year about parenting styles and the
Very cool.
yeah, it's an interesting, field and an interesting concept. I'm wondering how well it translates to pet ownership in comparison to raising a child. Obviously, they're two very different things, but for example, would a parent who has a more authoritarian style with their children be likely to also have that style with a pet? Or do they treat the pet completely differently than they do their children? Like, I expect more
Mm.
out of my children than I do my dog, for. More often than not, right? I don't expect him to take out his own garbage or clean up his own plates.
Exactly. And I think, especially with the field of like comparative cognition, that's like sort of my aim with the PhD is looking at how do those things really like, how do we treat our animals and dogs like similarly, but also differently in terms of like taking care of the animal. Like it was super interesting. We had a very large sample for our survey and we just did the online portion. Now we're going to do the in-person this summer, but we had no pet parents classified as permissive based on this version. This is like over 500 parents, and majority were authoritative, which is sort of like as we say, like the Goldilocks sort of version of things. But this is like
Right.
people answering online, so there might be like a very large bias for people to sort of see like, oh, I think that they want me to be this type of pet parent, but when in reality, like those things don't really matter. Like it's how you actually perceive, like whether or not you have a good relationship with your animal that's positive, right? So that was very interesting too. Like it's very cool to see like it over the summer, like if we get more people that are classified as permissive just because they're answering questions in person, rather than just doing it online as well, because there's like definitely biases there.
Yeah. And so are you going to observe people with their pets and then make a distinction on your own based on the interactions that you're able to observe? Or are you going to have them come in and fill out a survey in person thinking that that might change the way that they approach it? Or both? Is it a survey and then, well, play with your dog in front of me and I'll watch you and make a
Yes.
determination? Right?
Yes, basically both. So it's like the procedure is like people come in, we do like the demographic, the survey, and then for us, we're very interested in the changes between the environment and how they sort of react to it. So we have like an exploration phase where they're just going to see like how do they explore in a novel environment? Do they really like restrict their animal depending on how they view that, interacting with novel objects and things like that. And then we'll do an impulsivity task, and then we'll do a second exploration phase. And like the differences, like we're really interested in seeing like how do they sort of like get over what happened in the impulsivity task? Do they like restrict more? Do they not? And does that correlate with like this view of how people are really like pet parenting here?
Can you give me an example of what an impulsivity test might be? Last time we spoke, you referenced the marshmallow test and how we can actually apply that to pets in some way. Although I don't think my dog has the capacity to understand that if he doesn't eat the delicious treat now, that he might get a second one at a later date. I don't think he has that capacity, but is that the sort of thing that you're talking about? Putting something really delicious in front of them and seeing if they have the control to uh, not scarf it down immediately?
Yeah, and there's different ways of doing it, right? And it depends on there's a lot of training there, especially with dogs, where you really have to make sure like you're training properly to do something like sitting and waiting. Like that's very, very difficult. In our case, we're piloting a couple of different options, but one that's super cool is like it's like a transparent box. And then the most like it's basically like an A not B, where the most like obvious way to go through it is actually like a transparent wall, and then the animal has to know to go around it. So it's like that's a
Okay.
measure of impulsivity, right? So it's like it's really cute. Sometimes the dogs just run up and like bump their nose and they get a little bit confused because they're like, what's going on? But the dogs that do well at it sort of see that like, okay, like I have to go around, there's an open part of this box, and that's where I get the treat. And then they sort of like learn and adapt to that. And those dogs have different implications for like, for example, like service animal training. At really young ages now, we're able to find and tease apart animals that are like going to different routes for working animal placement. So that's also very cool. Um,
And I would imagine then that different breeds have different abilities in that sort of circumstance because we do tend to see very similar breeds in similar jobs, right?
mhm.
Seeing eye dogs tend to be German shepherds, and bomb sniffing dogs tend to be one breed, and that kind of thing, right?
I think like terriers are very common, border collies, German shepherds. The Malinois is like the police dog. People sort of joke that it's like the German Shepherd Plus, like the
Right.
subscription. They're really, really, they're so capable at. basically everything, like running, jumping, sniffing, like finding things. They're really, really amazing dogs, but they're huge. Yeah.
And
But
I wonder too if the size of the dog affects the way that someone might parent the dog. Because I know with my dog, I've always had very, very small dogs. And my concern really with them interacting with other dogs that are much bigger is that the other dog could significantly hurt my dog even while playing just by accident. And so you approach it in a slightly different way than you presumably would if it was a big dog, and maybe allow more behaviors in the home that would be destructive if the dog was huge, that aren't destructive if the dog's tiny, right?
yeah, and I think there's literature on how like small dogs tend to live more time indoors. And then there's certain aspects of like living indoors, you live in closer proximity with your owners or guardians, for example, and you could potentially have like more attention, more enrichment versus I think larger dogs tend to be more commonly housed outdoors or like have more time outdoors. So like there's different elements of like how much time people interact with their animal and then how that implicates the bond as well, which is pretty interesting. Like we just did a survey of primarily like police, but also different handlers and trainers across the world in dog research. And there was basically they had like a huge thing where all these people wrote comments about like what they thought was important to research and what wasn't. And they were so divisive on whether or not you have the dog in the home with them. And some people are like, this is integral to having a good bond for especially like bomb detection and things like that. And then other people were like, nope, my dog is outside. Like, this is the working relationship. This is the boundary we have. So it's very interesting because I think it's like very up to the human in that case and like the boundaries that they draw with the animal. Because there's a lot of different ways that I guess you can go about it.
Yeah, I genuinely cannot imagine having a dog as a partner in my job that I didn't get to hang out with at home as well. Like,
I'm the same way.
yeah, like people refer to their work husband or work wife, and if you have a work pet, that just feels weird on every level. Um,
It's true, it's true. And yeah, I think it's dependent on like a lot of different factors. Like, I'm assuming most of our sample is American or like from North America and Europe, but in different areas, like your animal can't go outside in certain like contexts and climates, especially in Canada. So like the culture is also residing around like the weather and how the animal is like housed and things like that that actually play a large part in the amount of time that they spend like with their handler or without.
yeah, that makes sense. And also, like my dog, like I said, being so tiny, I wouldn't let him out in the backyard all by himself. He has to sort of be with a person because we have hawks back there and they could take
Mhm.
him.
And coyotes,
Yeah.
common. Yeah.
Now, I assume that you have dogs yourself, more than one?
Yes, I have two. They're two rescues. One's a golden retriever, and then the other one, we have no clue. He's like a hound something. But he's very crafty. Like he actually we got him from a kill shelter. It was one of the reasons I was really interested in researching dogs because he's so clever. He's so clever and crafty and just will constantly outsmart the golden retriever. Like he's constantly playing games with him and tries to get like more food any way that he could possibly like have some sort of territorial advantage or anything like that. He's constantly on it. It's really, really fascinating.
Yeah, I our last dog we also had no clue what breed she was, but she also came from a kill shelter, and we thought we were going to have a lot of behavioral issues with her, but really she was pretty great and docile and not aggressive with anybody, and you don't. You assume something, I think, going into it, like, okay, we're going to have to put a lot of time and effort into training this dog and making sure she's okay. But she was fantastic right from the beginning.
That's amazing. It's pretty cool. I know there's like research that I was looking at the other day where they were saying like dogs and humans when they interact positively, like their brains can actually get in sync. So like using an EEG, which is a way that we map certain like brain waves, they found that like during mutual gaze, so like when a dog and a person are like just looking at each other or like experiencing petting, the brain activity patterns aligned like to really related areas of attention, which is also like really, really cool.
Yeah, that is cool. And I feel like that's something that I observe all the time. I feel like my wife and our dog are literally in sync at all times. When
On the same
she's sick,
wave.
he lies down on the bed and just waits for her to feel better. And that's.
That's amazing.
So does doing this kind of work change the way that you interact with your own dogs? Do you think about it differently? Do you see something in your dogs and say, "Oh, I'd really like to learn about this, and now I'm going to pursue that research avenue"?
I think especially with impulsivity, my golden retriever Fraser, he's he was neglected at the beginning of his developmental years, and he was just in a cage. So he actually doesn't have any concept about his size because when he was put in a cage, he never came out and he didn't really get to grow and has some physiological problems from that. But he had to learn his size. And like watching him learn this, like it was so fascinating because like we all interact with our environment and understand like very innate things about ourselves, but also like I know how big a cup is because I've been able to interact with the cup in so many different ways in my life. But he
Right.
literally like never had that experience. And especially with the impulsivity stuff, like I find it very, very fascinating because he like just now is like getting like the swing of things and he's maybe 7. So it's like I think we really take for granted how much we can impact animals' lives and just in general. And I think with dogs, like there's so many areas to research where like we've domesticated this animal for so many years and we're really reliant on it, dogs, in a lot of different contexts in society. So it's very cool to me that like there's a lot of ways that we could just learn about dogs, just like observing them in our own homes, you know.
Yeah.
Um, I'm sure people are kind of like having a dog. I feel like you're a little bit of if you're interested and curious about things, like you're kind of doing science anyway, because you're like, oh, like how does this react, or like how does my dog like this thing, or why is he doing that, you know?
Yes. Like I'm still trying to figure out why my current dog we've had 5 dogs before him over the many years, and he's the only one that doesn't seem to really enjoy cheese. I,
Interesting.
you know, I can't wrap my head around it. Carrots he loves like all the other dogs, but cheese not so much.
Just preference.
Yeah.
Not a cheese guy.
And this is my scientific quest. I'm sure I'll never get a proper answer, but so you've named your study perceptions of undesirable pet behavior so that it can be shoehorned into pups, right?
Yes.
Like, did you come up with the acronym first? This I want one day I'm going to have a, podcast series on the coming up with acronyms that we do in psychology, because this happens all the time. We need to find a word that's memorable and we're going to create the letters that go into that word, or we're just going to take random letters in the middle of a word so that we can make it into something that people will recognize. How do you come up with what was the genesis of the name of this study?
It was a bit of a Frankenstein approach. I'm not gonna lie. Like we took a very long time trying to figure out because with undesirable pet behaviors, there's one survey that's out there that's the DIAS, and that's looking at just impulsivity with dogs. But it's not as contextual as we were hoping because our environment's very naturalistic. And we really
What do you mean by that? The naturalistic?
like we wanted it to be, for example, like in an impulsivity task where it's like you have a lot of different objects and we're sort of fabricating and looking at like the detour of the animal going around something versus an impulsivity task could be like just leaving something in front of the dog and seeing what happens. So or like what's an impulsivity task that's a little bit more real to the person's life. So there's certain types of tasks that just really haven't correlated across with that measure. So there's like I think there's at least 5 or 6. There's one that's like a social one, even where they have a stingy experimenter and a generous experimenter, and then the animal learns one or the other one, and then they sort of see like how does that affect like the overall impulsivity of the dog. So we wanted to get a little bit more like what are like impulsivity things that happen in a life, like waiting for the animal to eat food, for example, before you put the food down and things like that. So we're going to test a bunch, but we're not too sure about how to go about it yet. We're in the piloting stage. But yeah, that's exciting too because I think there's a lot of things that we can look at with impulsivity that we haven't really thought of because they're hard to measure, especially with dogs with food. They're so food driven, right? So there's different ways to look at it. Like we even were talking about like making like a robot squirrel and like riding it around somewhere and like having that be a part of the study in the future, which could be fun too.
I like that. Yes, squirrels are a particular trigger for my little Steve. He really does not like them at all.
Yeah, they're
Or
like,
maybe he loves them. I genuinely can't interpret the barking and excited running behavior. Maybe he's trying to make friends. Maybe he's trying to drive them away. I don't know.
they're like very stimulating.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
Either way, they're very exciting. It
yeah.
used to be birds, but he's moved on from birds. He doesn't care about them anymore. He just kind of figures, well, they fly away and that's fine. But squirrels, I might be able to get to.
That's so funny. I love that.
So you wanted to talk about animal behavior. I do too, but writ large, as a bigger field of study in general, right? Animal behavior, I'm thinking is goes beyond pets and that sort of thing. A lot of the time it's people observing animals in the wild and trying to figure out how social structures work in say a meerkat colony, or
Mhm.
how elephants protect their young or think about motherhood and that sort of thing. I What are some of the things that drew you to that field in the first place?
Yeah, there's such cool research. I think the cuttlefish stuff. Are you familiar with the
I know of cuttlefish, but more so as a meal than as a creature that lives in the ocean and does stuff.
Yeah, they're kind of like squid-like, but they've been like found to actually pass like a version of the marshmallow task as well. And there's a very cool like sort of underbelly of comparative cognition where people are advocating for like sentience in animals because prior to that there was very little like legal protection of animals regarding like conservation and other things. Like this is the same test we're really talking about with dogs, where like people believe dogs are sentient, but even with cuttlefish, they found that like they were able to wait for a better meal for like over 130 seconds, for example, in terms of like I believe it was eating shrimp. Um, but like stuff like that, which is really cool, or like the work with octopi, where they were looking at there's so many different versions of like different studies with them, but there's like they've been able to use tools in really, really innovative ways, like throwing projectiles, or like in terms, I believe it's like mating. They
Like
can like throw.
an octopus will throw a tool while mating, like to get someone's attention or to distract a predator while they're in the mating process.
They aren't too sure. Like they look at like many like the throwing occurred during like mating or competition. So they're not sure if they like are trying to like repel them, or like they're just interacting in different ways. But the tool use between like an octopus or like with corvids, like different types of crows, they're able to solve like upwards of like I think over 15 different like puzzles to locate food and like use tools and manipulate tools in ways that are like really, really, really fascinating. Um,
Yeah, crows are
that's pretty
super
cool.
interesting to me. Like, I want
Hmm.
to see the crow dog interaction study because
Exactly.
the first dog that we ever had, it was a toy poodle. Her name was Muffin, and we inherited her from my father-in-law's wife who passed away. And she's very old and very set in her ways. We come out in the backyard and she would bark at all the birds. And eventually there was a crow that learned to mimic her bark and would bark right back at her. And the two of them would bark at each other. And I just thought it was super clever and also kind of dickish. And I thought, it's kind of amazing that a crow has learned to just be irritating. That I feel like that's normally the purview of human beings only, but no, they wanted to
Totally.
do it too.
That's so interesting you say that because I think. 2 or 3 years ago, there was a study published where they showed that crows can actually show recursion understanding, which is like the ability to embed structures within structures, which is a very, very key, like mostly argued, like only human concept of grammar that we like learn as we learn language. And in one experiment, crows were trained to pack, I believe it was a sequence of like bracket symbols in a center like embedded order. So it was like this type of bracket, and then there was like curly bracket and then square bracket. And then when they were tested on new combinations, they arranged the new novel stimuli above chance for like recursive patterns. So they were like able to learn patterns at a way that like humans really only do with like grammar and different ways of how we learn things. And they're like comparable to monkeys or even like 3 to 4 year old children on this type of task. Like crows are so cool.
Yeah.
Crows are really, really fascinating.
Is that the next research project? Are you going to branch out
I
into
would
other
love
types of
that.
animals?
I would love that. It's really cool. Like people that stay in comparative cognition, there's a lady that just got a really awesome award at the Comparative Cognition Society, and she'd done work with like over 150 species, from like bumblebees to polar bears to giraffes. Like it's it's a really you could be all over the place, I think.
I imagine the study with bumblebees is vastly different in terms of setup and execution than the one with giraffes.
Yes, the bumblebee work is pretty cool.
What is some of that bumblebee work? What are they? I know that there's a lot of studies about, what the drone bees do and the worker bees and the relationship to the queen and all that kind of thing in a hive. But I also know that that's only one type of bee that has that setup and the other bees do something different. I don't know
Yeah.
that much about bees.
Yeah, like they've been shown to have like social learning, which is again like something that primarily has been like more primate research, but they can use tools to open things. There was a lady, she just done this with a different type of bee, but they were able to show like how they were able to use a ball. They actually really like playing on balls, like, and they roll themselves over top of balls, but they're able to move balls in ways that they can open up doors to get into a place to grab food. So they can solve puzzles like very like if they're interested in the object. I think like the ball thing is a very like a little bit more new in terms of the literature there, but they're able to like roll themselves on top of a ball to open up like a door and then gain like a food reward and things like that, which is really cool.
That is cool. And
Yeah.
so when you say comparative cognition, right? Or is
Mhm.
that's the phrase you use, right? Are we
Yeah.
comparing the level of cognition of one animal to another or animals to humans? Or are we comparing it to other animals in the same group, right? Like if a crow can solve a more complex puzzle at the level of a 3 or 4 year old human child versus a cuttlefish who can pass a marshmallow test, that's two totally different types of cognition, I think, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's like the culmination of how different animal species, also humans with non-animals, those are sort of like people segregate them, but it's cool. It's important to look at the differences and similarities across both. How animal species think and also behave. And I think primarily the goal has been to understand evolution, also just the origins of overall cognition. So the question like what is cognition is a very like philosophical one that I'm sure anybody in this field would have a very different view or
Yeah.
answer of it. But I think it's primarily to sort of see like are we able to run the same experiment and understand different things across like the corvids or humans, or like why are humans so close to primates in this task, or why I believe there's like magic tricks that have been done in the UK, and they showed like how some crows like actually aren't fooled by sleight of hand gestures as much as humans are. And then they were looking into like, so what's the perception of that with the human eye? Like, is that something that's like that leads us more astray in that case? Or is it like more of a physiological thing? Or is it more behavioral, right? So the cognition side of that, I think, is like really dependent on the behavior. The goal is sort of to compare across those and see like how does evolution like create these traits that now we're able to behave in a certain way or think a certain thing.
Maybe the magician isn't trying as hard because he thinks in his head, It's a crow. The crow's not going to get it, you know?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, like illusion sort of things with like the sleight of hand gestures and things like that. I believe it was Nikki Clayton's lab. It's a cool.
What are some of the results that we get out of this? What are some of the things that we're able to do better in relation to animal populations, knowing some of this stuff and having studied this?
I'll just highlight the dogs because I think it's sort of where I'm sitting right now.
And they're
But
the cutest.
they're I'm a little bit biased. But yeah, I think with dogs especially, dogs are used in like endangered species detection. So before we would have to capture the species to gain data from them, but now we have the understanding of how to get DNA from scat, and then dogs are trained to find the scat, and then we're able to find as much as like all the other animals in the area that are endangered without actually collecting them. So it's a much less invasive thing. And now we're using dogs in that field, which has really made a lot of big strides there. Service animal placement and guide animal placement is very, very, very important, especially for most recently, there's areas in like PTSD interventions for veterans where people really didn't think that dogs would be more than a companion for these people, but now we're able to train dogs with what we know about like the clinical side of PTSD, especially. And there's been a lot of money put into it in the States, and a lot of people are really benefiting from those programs now.
And I just read an article saying that cats are being looked at in the same way and that they are
Mhm.
showing some promising results as well.
Which is very cool. And then, yeah, people really could like pick and choose.
Yeah.
Which would be cool. Yeah, so I think like those are two really key ones. And then obviously finding like lost people, bomb detection, police work. Those are sort of your German Shepherd Malinois populations with handlers and trainers, and a lot of like even endangered species. I know like the dogs come on boats and they're able to smell like different marine animals as well for endangered species detection that people can't or we don't
Wow.
have a way to locate, right? So yeah, dogs are used as like a very important tool across society that has a lot of really cool implications for that as well.
Yeah, that is really neat. Being training dogs to sniff out the scat of endangered species so that you can just basically use their poo to know how prevalent they are. Kind of the same way they measured the wastewater during COVID to know how
Exactly.
much was in that population, right? That's wild.
It's very
And
cool.
obviously, animals are great at determining which people are awesome, dog people, and which ones are not, cat people.
It's a big swing.
Yeah,
But
that's
yeah.
just a disclaimer that is my own personal opinion and not that of the CPA. And
I like it.
whether you're a cat person or a dog person or a pot-bellied pig person, you learn something from the animals around you. And in doing so, you advance science just a little bit. Links to some of the scientific studies Hannah mentioned are in today's show notes. And thanks to Hannah for taking the time to speak with me today. To you, our listeners, for taking the time to get to know Hannah Burrows a little better. Mindful is written, hosted, and published by me, Eric Bowman. Our producer and editor is Jamie Montgomery. And our theme music is Avenues by David Taylor.